All right, everyone, we're in for a treat today. Thank you for coming to the Professor Spotlight. Today, we have Dr. George Soroka here, who is a lecturer on government. Dr. Soroka has a PhD in political science from Harvard, and he specializes in Eastern and Central European comparative politics and international relations. We're really fortunate to have him. He did an incredible lecture last year with the International Relations Club. And so it's very exciting to have him back today here for this HESA event alongside the Veterans Society. So without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. George Soroka. Thank you for being here today, sir.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Amina, for that nice introduction. I think, as I mentioned to the people who were here earlier, I think this is a really incredibly important topic, and it's one that we should all be concerned about in the world today. So I'm delighted to speak with you. We have a fairly small audience, at least live audience. So I would really like to do this in an interactive fashion. I have some slides I want to show you and some things to say, but hopefully we'll leave enough time for a substantive discussion or Q&A at the end. But as we get going, I also have a question for the audience members. I'm curious, how do you define propaganda? Clearly, if you hit the Zoom link for this, you must have some inkling or suspicion of what you're in for. So how do people think of propaganda? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious to see what comes to mind when you hear that term. Igor?
Hey, George, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. So I would think propaganda is when governments or large institutions package information in ways that are misleading in order to achieve a certain agenda. So, and it's not necessarily non-factual, but facts are presented in misleading ways so that it can be claimed to be truthful while not presenting information accurately at the same time.
Interesting. Okay, so the two key points you made are misleading information and someone having an agenda, some ulterior motive to presenting the information this way. I think that's getting us very much in the direction of what propaganda is. Does anyone else have an idea or definition that they want to share? You're just waiting for me to tell you?
I think the only thing that I would add would be that it's a manipulation. It's a deliberate manipulation. So there's a sense of intent, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think that idea of intentionality is really important as well. I saw another hand go up. Does anyone want to add anything to this?
That was mine, Dr. Soroka, and I was thinking what Danielle said about there's an intent behind it. It's not something that happens accidentally.
Right. No, that's quite true. Max?
I'll go as far as to say that I consider it a contemporary weapon.
A contemporary weapon. Well, I agree with you, it's often weaponized, but as you'll see in a moment, it's not necessarily a contemporary weapon, although maybe its usage has increased in the world we currently live in. Sometimes it's easier, though, to define something with an example. Does anyone just really quickly have an example of what you think is propaganda or something you've seen recently that might be propagandistic in its intent? Max?
Putin's justification of not only the annexation of Crimea, but the invasion of Ukraine as a whole.
Right. So Vladimir Putin's justification for invading Ukraine. I've actually written on this quite a bit, and I have more material on this coming out. I think that's a very good example of propaganda. If you watch the two speeches he gave right before the invasion began, and actually, if you watch the Tucker Carlson interview more recently, he tries to justify it very much in historical terms. But you know, honestly, on the face of it, if you didn't know much, it kind of sounds like, okay, he might have some points, but the history he employs is very tendentious. It's a very selective, self-serving reading of history. Okay, I have a final question for you, and then I promise I'll get to the presentation. You weren't expecting to be part of this so actively, but I love talking to my students, so I can't help myself. Are educators propagandists, do you think?
I'm going to speak up here as a teacher. I'm a classroom teacher. I teach high school English. And in the state of North Carolina in particular, there's certainly a lot of accusations that we are. Moms for Liberty is coming at us hard. The GOP nominee for the state superintendent is a woman who is a mouthpiece for Moms for Liberty, who's never had a kid in public school and was at the January 6th insurrection. So we are seeing a lot of that bleed into education, especially with book bans. I would like to think that what I do in my classroom is certainly not a level of propaganda, but we just started our study of Elie Wiesel's Night, and I made it very clear to my students that any implications of things like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia would not be tolerated in my classroom. And that certainly lands me square in the lap of what the Republicans in the state of North Carolina call being a woke teacher. So there's certainly a perception that we are potentially propagandist on some level.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult time to be an educator, certainly. And it's not something only coming from the Republican side. It's also coming from the Democratic side, I think, in some cases. I think the point is people really have very strong feelings about things, and this is bleeding over into what educators do. Now, it's also a little bit of a tough question to answer, I think. I would like to think I'm not a propagandist, but at the same time, I do curate the information that my students think about, right? I always tell my students, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I am going to tell you what to think about, because that's my role, right? I put together the syllabus, I lead the discussions. However, what do you do with someone who denies the Holocaust? I mean, this has no place. This has no pedagogical purpose in my classroom. But they might accuse me of being a propagandist for not allowing that voice to be heard, or for someone who is a proponent of flat earth theories or an anti-vaxxer. I promised I would tell you what I was having an email about. I just unfortunately had an email exchange earlier today where one of the members of a board that I sit on, which unfortunately deals with very vulnerable populations, elderly populations, posted a very conspiratorial message denying the efficacy of COVID vaccines, terming them the death shot. So this is something that very unexpectedly, I mean, it plays into the topic today, but I had to deal with this morning because I'm really concerned about some of the misinformation that's being spread. All right, let me talk to you a little bit about what propaganda is, where it comes from, and maybe what it isn't, okay? And then hopefully we'll have time for a good conversation at the end. So I'm just going to share my slides. Please bear with me for a second. Okay. So you might wonder why I'm starting with a coin. Well, this is a coin of Augustus Caesar, otherwise known as Octavian. He was Julius Caesar's adopted son. They actually did have a rather distant genetic relationship. Octavian was Julius Caesar's great nephew. The reverse of this coin is interesting. That's what I want you to pay attention to. It says Divine Julius in Latin. You may not know this, but Julius Caesar was posthumously divinized by the Roman Senate. He was declared a god. Kind of a neat trick if you can pull it off. This is an early instance of propaganda, right? Octavian was having issues with his legitimacy. So he ordered this coinage to be made, these coins to be minted, with this message, reminding people that he was the son of a literal god. Yeah, Max, very much in order to legitimize him. Max asked a question in the chat. So here are two formal definitions of propaganda that I can share with you. As you read them, please notice that propaganda is to some extent in the eye of the beholder. We'll talk more about that in a moment. There are various definitions of propaganda out there. I'm going to present to you what I think is the best attested definition and academic way of seeing this concept, but certainly there are others out there. So Jowett and O'Donnell, who have a very well-known textbook on propaganda, it's called Propaganda and Persuasion, define it this way. It's the deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. Please notice, those of you who were brave enough to answer my question of how to define propaganda at the beginning of this talk basically hit all of these points. So I'm really pleased about that. You seem to have a good grasp of what propaganda is already. Bruce Smith's definition is a little bit more comprehensive. It's the more or less systematic effort to manipulate other people's beliefs, attitudes, or actions by means of symbols, deliberateness, and a relatively heavy emphasis on manipulation distinguish propaganda from casual conversation or the free and easy exchange of ideas. Propagandists have again, this is important, a specified goal or set of goals. To achieve these, they deliberately select facts, arguments, and displays of symbols and present them in ways they think will have the most effect. To maximize effect, they may omit or distort pertinent facts or simply lie, and they may try to divert the attention of the reactors from everything but their own propaganda. So one interesting thing to note here, it's implicit in Smith's definition, is that propaganda doesn't always have to be about a lie, right? Propaganda can be about truth, but a selective presentation of truth, a selective telling of truth. So let me tell you about the history of this term. Now, propaganda, I'm going to show you some slides to try to convince you of this, is as old as time, right? As the initial cover slide connoted with Octavian's coin. But the term propaganda derives from the Congregation for the Propagation of Faith, an organization of Roman Catholic cardinals that was founded in 1622. And it was really founded to serve as a bulwark against the Protestant Reformation. It was founded to counter the Protestant Reformation and secondarily to carry out missionary work or missionizing work. And this is important because while propaganda may be old as time, we haven't employed this term to describe a lot of its manifestations that we'll be seeing in a few moments. Propaganda was not a term that was widely used up until the 20th century, and it really, when it was used, didn't have a negative social connotation until the 20th century, and particularly after World War I, right? Now you say someone's engaging in propaganda, it has normatively not a positive association, right? The idea is someone's trying to manipulate you, someone's trying to hoodwink you. But propaganda itself had a much more neutral valence throughout much of the history of this term's usage. And the other thing to keep in mind, as I show you my next set of slides, is that propaganda can be visual and tactile. By tactile, I mean something like a coin that you can hold, as well as verbal and written. And this is important, I think, to understand. Well, early instance of propaganda, the Egyptian pharaohs. The Egyptian pharaohs were literally held to be Horus incarnate. Horus was the Egyptian sky god, god of the sun, god of kingship, right? I mean, again, a pretty nice instance of propaganda if you can get away with it. The other thing that's important to note is Egyptian pharaohs were the only ones who could make offerings in the temple. So they had this link to the divine. They were always depicted as young and youthful and vibrant, although we know now from x-rays of mummies and reconstructions of facial features that often they were diseased and they had a lot of inbreeding. This is because brother-sister marriage was practiced among them for a time at least. You know, if you're literally a god, it's hard to find someone worthy of being your partner, right? But very much this idea that the pharaohs were somehow completely removed from ordinary humans. Here are some other ancient and medieval forms of propaganda. So let's go from top left down to bottom right. The first image is of a woodcut of a cynocephalus. Cynocephali are dogmen, and this is often how medieval cartographers depicted other civilizations or people living in other civilizations where not much was known about them. They were depicted as other. They were depicted as subhuman or even not human at all. There's actually a very interesting tradition of these images. We don't have time to talk about them today, but certainly an early form of othering propaganda. The next image over going to the right is of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal fighting a lion, right? So again, very visual image that seeks to legitimize the bravery and the courage and the strength, the sort of manly virtues, if we can say that, of the king. Pyramids were constructed, often construction began on them as soon as a pharaoh took office because they could take literally decades to build. And their purpose was very much to, again, show off and set off the degree to which pharaohs were removed from ordinary human beings. And finally, you see a image from a medieval hagiography. For those of you who don't know what a hagiography is a life of a saint. And the point of a hagiography is not to be a biographical account, but it's to be an instructional account. It's to tell you how this person lived a saintly Christian life and why you should imitate this person's life. Here are some more recent examples. So the Boston Massacre occurred approximately 6 miles from where I'm currently sitting. I could walk there in a couple of hours. The reason I say this is an example of propaganda is because what a lot of people don't realize is that the British didn't just fire on the colonists. The British had been taunted for hours by the colonists. They had snowballs thrown at them. They had rocks thrown at them. The other thing that is not visible here is one of the early casualties, one of the first people to die was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Now, Crispus Attucks was, the accounts differ a little bit about his genealogy, but he was at least a Black man, and it's likely he had some indigenous ancestry as well, meaning Native American ancestry. He's not depicted, right? And a lot of people have suggested, and I think with good cause, that Paul Revere's engraving was meant to incite the colonists against the British. So you wanted to make this look as if, not to justify what happened, but to make it look as if it were totally unprovoked. And certainly if you wanted to gain sympathy among the widest swath of the population at that time, you probably didn't want to depict a Black man as being the victim. You wanted to depict white people as being victims. Here's another example. Who remembers Tennyson's poem, "Into the Valley of Death rode the 600, right? Well, I want to suggest to you that this was actually a brilliant piece of propaganda. Tennyson was the poet laureate of Britain at the time. And his poem is now known by school children all over the world, including in the United States. And it kind of valorizes this group that charged into certain death as brave, when in reality, this was a completely boneheaded move by their officers to order them to charge into a valley where they had no hope of escape from, and where the Russians were able to shoot and essentially annihilate them. Here are some other examples. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Please notice the scale. Look at those little people at the bottom. These statues are gosh, I think they're 70 something feet tall, 70 plus feet tall, somewhere around there, if memory serves. Here is another example. So this is from Turkmenistan, a statue of Sapir Murat Niyazov, who was known as Turkmenbashi. In case you're wondering, Turkmenbashi literally means the father of the Turkmen, right? He was an interesting character. He actually, for a time, renamed the months of the year after his family members. But I want to suggest to you, if you ever are in a position where you're standing in front of a golden statue that rotates to face the sun, you're probably in a regime that's engaging in some propaganda. But what's important to note is that propaganda really took off in the early 20th century, and it really took off during World War I. And that happened for a number of reasons. It was kind of a perfect storm. It was a confluence of technological advancement, and it was also a confluence of increases in literacy. So essentially what you had happening, you had people becoming more literate in many Western societies, certainly in the United States, with schooling being expanded. You had new types of technology. So not only broadsheet newspapers that were circulated more and more widely, but also the advent of radio and silent motion pictures, and eventually the talkies, as they were called, movies with voiceovers, and finally color television and social media. So literacy, on the one hand, technological innovation, making it easier to get messages out quickly. And part of that innovation was also an increase in connectivity between people and various places, right? Before you had to mail a letter, let's say overseas, it would literally take weeks, if not months, to get there. But eventually you had the telegraph, and eventually you had the telephone. It just made it much easier for people to communicate. So this is why I call this a perfect storm, that not only increased information literacy, but also increased the use of propaganda. This is an early example of this. So the United States formed this Committee on Public Information because Woodrow Wilson had, when he was running for office, pledged to keep the United States out of World War I. America and Americans were still very isolationist at the time. And then he reversed that promise. So he had to figure out a way to get Americans to support going into World War I, taking an active role, right? And this is exactly what the Creel Commission, it's known eponymously as the Creel Commission after George Creel, who headed it up, was tasked with doing. There's a lot I can say about this, but for the sake of time, I'll skip over it. If anyone has questions, I'm more than happy to answer them in Q&A. One of the people I will mention that came out of the Creel Commission was this guy by the name of Edward Bernays, really interesting figure. His granddaughter, I just found out recently, still lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was not in Cambridge. He was in New York, I believe. But he was not the only one. He was one of the most prominent coming out of the Creel Commission, but he was not the only one who went on and applied many of the propaganda techniques that the Creel Commission came up with to influence opinion about US going into World War I to public relations, to advertising basically later. And there is this really interesting and close symbiosis between political propaganda and economic propaganda. He's known as the father of public relations. He later essentially took a big hand in orchestrating a coup in Guatemala. If you're interested in looking that up, look up United Fruit, the company he was repping at the time. But he was a very cynical guy. He didn't have much use for democracy, and he didn't have much use for the average man. He kind of thought the average person, woman or man, was of low intelligence and not really someone that could be trusted, right? And this quote, I think, is quite telling. Intelligent men must realize that propaganda is that which they can fight for productive ends and help bring order out of chaos. I'm sorry, I think I was transferring these slides from another file, and I think something must have got cut here. But basically, he's saying that, propaganda is neutral. Everyone's going to use propaganda. So why don't I use it? Why don't people use it for ends that ordinary people can't be trusted to achieve on their own? I can't resist telling you very quickly about this. This is an early instance of a very successful advertising campaign. So this woman, Bertha Hunt, along with some quote unquote friends, marched down Fifth Avenue in New York, in Manhattan, which, if any of you know Manhattan, is one of the main thoroughfares, smoking a cigarette. Now, the reason why this is important is before this, cigarettes were not smoked by women. They were associated with something that fallen women did, something that what prostitutes did, or women of quote unquote ill repute did. But Bernays was hired by American Tobacco to increase smoking among women because the head of the company was trying to boost sales, and he realized that while smoking rates were very high among men at the time, I think his name was George Washington Hunt, really interesting name. Women weren't smoking, at least the vast majority of women weren't. So he basically thought, you know, I can double my market if I can convince women to smoke. And Bernays went for this lock, stock, and barrel. He called them torches of freedom, right? So he rebranded cigarettes from something that was associated with loose morals and prostitution into a feminist symbol, right? Women can smoke cigarettes because they're torches of freedom. They're symbols of emancipation. What's interesting here is that he didn't bother telling people. This quote is from an interview that Bertha Hunt gave to the New York Times, and it was published on, of all days, April 1st of that year. What neither he nor Bertha Hunt told people, though, was that she was his secretary. So the whole thing was staged. And it actually had an appreciable effect. The rate at which women smoked went up pretty dramatically afterwards. One interesting thing to note, apparently Bernays hated the habit. He was not a smoker, and his wife Doris smoked, and he, for years, apparently tried to get her to quit. Here's another example. So propaganda really came into its own in World War II. This is the total war speech that was given in February 1943 by Joseph Goebbels, who was Adolf Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. Yes, that was his actual title. The speech is interesting because it addressed the German public through a very staged event. So this was in the Sports Palace, a major gathering spot in Berlin. The audience was very carefully chosen. And in this speech, Goebbels argued for total war. He said the population must mobilize and give its all to defeat the Allied powers and to achieve the goals of the Fuhrer and the fatherland. The speech is also interesting because during it, Goebbels, we don't know whether this was intentional or not, he nearly admitted the Holocaust. He started to say the annihilation of the Jews, and then he changed the word. The words in German are very similar to the exclusion of the Jews. Right, so we went from killing the Jews to excluding them from German society. That was the connotation. We're not quite sure whether this was deliberate or not. These were Albert Speer's thoughts on Goebbels' speech. He writes, except for Hitler's most successful public meetings, Speer, for those of you who don't know, was also a Nazi, but he wasn't as deeply in cahoots with Hitler as Goebbels certainly was. Except for Hitler's most successful public meetings, I had never seen an audience so effectively roused to fanaticism. Back in his home, Goebbels astonished me by analyzing what had seemed to be a purely emotional outburst in terms of its psychological effects, much as an experienced actor must have done. He rehearsed this speech multiple times, by the way. It comes off as being very extemporaneous, but it was anything but. He was also satisfied with his audience that evening. Did you notice? They reacted to the smallest nuance and applauded at just the right moments. It was the politically best trained audience you could find in Germany. Now, here's the thing. Propaganda, though, was not only used on the German side. And I'll get to that in a moment. Before I do, though, I wanted to show you these 5 rules of propaganda. They're all sorts of guides for how to recognize propaganda or potentially how to engage in propaganda. Hitler's is the most basic. This comes directly out of Mein Kampf. My Struggle is the translation of that title into English. He was not a particularly deep thinker, but he hit some major points of propaganda. Avoid abstract ideas and instead appeal to emotions. Hit them viscerally, right? Hit them in the belly, hit them in the heart, not in the head. Constantly repeat just a few ideas. You keep repeating the same ideas, you're going to move the goalposts, right? Eventually, at least some people will start to believe you. Why bother presenting both sides of the argument? Just give them your side. Constantly criticize enemies of the state. And here's the particularly chilling one. Single out one enemy, one special enemy for vilification, right? We have problems. These problems are all the fault of this one group. But as I said, other powers also engaged in propaganda. Frank Capra, beloved US film director. He was actually an immigrant from Italy. He came over when he was 5. He was a genuine rags to riches story. And he was basically hired by the War Department to make propaganda films, to initially tell young American draftees why they were going to fight in World War II. And later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the films and he liked them so much that he had them released to the general public. And they were very popular, actually. Capra was a wonderful director. For those of you who don't know or remember, he directed movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It's a Wonderful Life, movies we still know today in the United States. But during the war, he ended up directing these 7 information films. Now, you may sit here and say, well, but that's a good thing because he was getting us into the fight against the Nazis. Well, okay, but his films certainly meet the definition of propaganda if we employ kind of a agnostic academic definition. Among other things, he portrayed the Soviet Union in a sympathetic light to get people to support us allying with Joseph Stalin, even though among State Department folks, it was well known that Stalin was committing crimes and had committed atrocities in the Soviet Union against his own people. All right, so let's parse propaganda a little bit. I think it's important to realize there are different types of propaganda. There's kind of an action-oriented propaganda that is seeking to make you do something right now. But there's also a more pernicious propaganda that operates over longer spans of time. And this is propaganda that seeks to indoctrinate you. It's sometimes called sub-propaganda. It's sometimes called priming propaganda. It's an interesting phenomenon, and maybe you can reflect on how historically, I think this is a good example, some groups have been depicted in, let's say, Hollywood movies, right? And whether that primed the audience for how they relate to, let's say, African Americans or Muslims or people from Eastern Europe. These were all kind of stereotypical villains at one point or another in much of our cultural production in this country. And there's also this phenomenon of passivity-oriented propaganda, which basically seeks to keep the audience from engaging in any activity or seeks to keep the audience from panicking. I'm not saying that this is propaganda in sort of a hard sense of the term, but what always comes to mind when I talk about this is I remember, because I'm of an age where I remember very clearly the 9/11 attacks, September 9/11 attacks. I actually flew through Logan. I came back from Russia the day before the hijackers flew out of Logan in their deadly attacks on the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and then the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania when the passengers aboard apparently forced it down. I always remember George Bush going on television and saying, go shopping, right? That was basically his point. I mean, he was saying, we have to keep the economy going in the United States. We shouldn't panic. But to my mind, that was a very good example of this kind of passivity-oriented propaganda. Like, we're taking care of it. You all just go shopping, make sure the economy keeps rolling along. Okay, so let's talk a little bit in the time we have remaining about the differences between persuasion and propaganda, because this is really important. Both of these concepts seek to win others over to a desired position. However, I want to suggest to you that the key difference here is that if I engage in persuasion with you, I'm not hiding my motives. I'm also not hiding information from you. I'm just trying to convince you that I'm making the best argument. But I'm fully aware, or at least I hope, that you have all of the information available to you, and that I'm going to convince you to support my position because of the strength of my argument, not because I'm withholding evidence from you. Right? Whereas a propagandist does not have the same compunction. Now, this is also important. Propaganda and propagandistic claims do not necessarily need to be false or made insincerely, although frequently they are both. And positionality and subjectivity matter. So one person's propaganda may be another person's relative truth. Here's what I mean by this. Particularly in this age of social media, which we'll get to in a moment in more detail, it's hard to say who's the propagandist. So like this person I mentioned earlier who sent this email basically denying COVID vaccines and claiming that they're killing people, I think he genuinely believes this. So does that make him a propagandist? It's not entirely clear, right? We've probably all had the experience of our crazy aunt or uncle posting some nonsense on Facebook, right? Or somewhere else. But if they genuinely believe this, it's not clear that they're the propagandist versus being a tool through which a propagandist operates. Right. So this is what I mean by positionality matters. And there are people who may repeat propagandistic claims who we might consider not to be propagandists in and of themselves if they sincerely believe these claims. Now, the other thing, and I will warn you, this is controversial, but subjectivity matters. So if we take a standard academic definition of propaganda, religion could be considered to be propaganda. Right? People generally don't say, well, come check out my religion, and this is what other religions teach, and this is why I think mine is best. No, they say, we have the truth, right? We are the way. Follow us, at least if you're one of the proselytizing monotheistic faiths, right? But again, I want to be very cognizant of the fact that for some people, religion is also a revelation of ultimate truth, right? They take huge comfort in it. They firmly believe in the precepts of it. So, right, how you approach something and the position you approach something from really matters. And just to be clear, I'm not making any claims here. I'm just trying to get you to see both sides of the argument from the point of a believer and the point of an atheist, right? You may see the same claims and come to very different conclusions. Okay, this is maybe the most important part of what I'm going to tell you today. I really want you to understand that propaganda is not just something that occurs out there. It's not just something that Russia does or North Korea does. It's not something that always beats you over the head. Propaganda also occurs in liberal democracies. And this is important to know. Whether it's in advertising, whether it's in political rhetoric, propaganda happens here as well. And I think as thinking individuals, as presumably, if you're in the United States, concerned citizens, you need to be aware of this. I don't care what your political feelings are. I don't care which party you support. They both engage in what could be considered propaganda at various points in time. But I would really like for you to at least realize when it's happening and to think critically about it. Now, I borrow this from Jason Stanley, who has a wonderful book called How Propaganda Works. Stanley is a philosopher who is at Yale University. And he says that in an authoritarian regime, The danger is that propaganda isn't taken seriously, right? That propaganda is just so over the top, so overt that we kind of ignore it, right? That we don't take it seriously. But in a liberal democracy, the danger is that propaganda is not recognized as propaganda. Right? I'm less convinced by the former of Stanley's claims than I am by the latter. I mentioned COVID denialism. Here's something that's been in the news quite a bit recently. We have a lot of evidence now that Russia and China at the state level were actively spreading disinformation about COVID-19 to sow discord in Western democracies. There's a interesting case from France where the French intelligence service actually went public with what they normally don't go public with to show how Russian influence operation tried to pay off French bloggers to spread misinformation about the Pfizer vaccine and its efficacy. We know that the same was being done in the United States and in multiple other countries as well. But here's what I think has really changed. We are much more susceptible to social media just because we're spending so much time on social media. So remember when I said propaganda and its interpretation and its effect really changed around the beginning of the 20th century because of this triumvirate of increasing technology, increasing connectivity, and also increasing literacy? Well, I submit to you that it also really changed in the last 20 years or so. And that's due to not only the proliferation of social media, but also the fact that we are all walking around now with computers in our pockets. We call them phones, but they're actually computers. Most of us don't actually call people any longer, right? Interestingly enough, these computers are more powerful than the computer that was used to send the first space shuttle into space in the early 1980s. Just look at this time spent per day engaging with digital versus traditional media, right? Traditional media encompasses newspapers, television watching, whereas digital media encompasses staring at your smartphone or looking at Facebook, looking at Reddit, what have you, Instagram, TikTok. It's astounding, right? And the cut point here was right around the time of a really contentious presidential election in the United States. So the way we've done politics, the way we engage with politics, and the way we engage with propaganda surrounding politics and also advertising has fundamentally changed within all of our lifetimes. And this begs this interesting question. Are we all propagandists now, right? Because the thing is, social media demands participation, right? When you read a newspaper, you're passively engaged with the newspaper. But when you read digital media, you can actively engage with it. You can leave a comment. You can leave a like. You could forward it to someone. And I think this is a really fascinating question. To what degree now do we all participate in spreading, potentially, maybe unwittingly, propaganda? So I took these points from this really interesting article by Rogers, Bienvenu, and Kelton, but other people have made these same points as well. The engagement aspect of social media is what I suggest to you is very different than prior forms of media, right? Because movies couldn't demand it of us. Radio couldn't demand it of us. Newspapers couldn't demand it of us. But social media can and does demand it of us. All right, I know we're getting a little long on time, so let me finish up quickly. This is from a well-known Facebook, when it was still called Facebook, now it's known as Meta, white paper that was put out in 2017, basically providing a typology of a typical disinformation pathway on social media. Targeted data collection, content creation, and false amplification, right? False amplification is particularly interesting because you can have fake accounts created to spread misinformation online in ways that it was never possible to do earlier. Let me give you an example of what this might look like. So this is an actual spoofed news website that the intelligence or data security people at Facebook found was linked to Russian intelligence services, right? So this is from July 7th, 2022, and it looks very similar. The only part missing in the bottom, which is the spoofed site, is the donation bar, right? The support the Guardian bar, but it purports to be the same day. The top is the actual Guardian news site. The bottom is the spoofed site. Video, false staging in Bucha revealed, right? So Bucha is this very well-known massacre of civilians that occurred in Ukraine by the Russian troops in early 2022. Completely different from what the actual news site was putting out, right? But if you just looked at this quickly, you might be forgiven for not realizing that this wasn't the actual Guardian site, right? The Guardian is this sort of left-leaning, well-known newspaper out of the United Kingdom. So let's finish up with thinking a little bit about potential drivers of propaganda in liberal democracies. And I'm doing this because I think in authoritarian contexts, propaganda tends to be pretty overt, right? And you can actually have two types of propaganda in authoritarian contexts. You can have propaganda that seeks to legitimate the authorities, which is a little softer. And you can have just completely over-the-top propaganda, which actually is also serving a really interesting signaling function, right? Because it's saying, well, we could say whatever we want, even though we know people don't believe it, but we are so powerful, you can't go against us, right? So an example of the latter would be some of the fantastical claims coming out of North Korea that the founder of the regime was born on a sacred hill, and then when he was born, the season shifted from winter to spring, and a new star appeared in the heavens. In reality, we know that he was born in a Soviet camp. We have the documents showing this, right? But the point is, the regime can put out this kind of over-the-top information because it's just a sign that we can say whatever we want. No one is powerful enough to challenge us. Versus more recently, North Korea has taken a page from China and it's started to really try to appeal to Western audiences by peddling soft propaganda, by having in one famous series of video, kind of a pretty young North Korean woman who speaks relatively good English, appeal to Western audiences by saying, hey, everything you've heard about us is not quite true. Let me tell you the truth, right? But in liberal democracies, we tend to have four drivers. These are grassroots movements. All right, so basically citizens getting together, people getting together and pushing a narrative. We can have elites pushing a narrative, so politicians. We can have the media pushing a narrative. And we can have institutions pushing a narrative. What do I mean by institutions? Well, this is what I mean. One of the really concerning things for people who study propaganda is how compressed the media sphere has become in the United States. And again, I don't care what your political predilections are. This affects everyone, right? Basically, particularly in radio, but also in television, we've gone from having multiple independent purveyors of information to having information really controlled by a handful of conglomerates, by a handful of big media companies. So I'm going to leave you with this quote that's on the slide. And I think it's someone that all of us who are thinking individuals who maybe care about the state of our democracy. So I started with more of an empirical take on propaganda. I'm ending this talk with a more normative take-up propaganda should be really concerned with, and something we should give thought to. Thank you very much. That was the talk. We have a little bit of time, so I'm happy to entertain any questions people may have.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Soroka. Looks like we have 8 minutes left, but I really want to open the floor a little bit longer for anyone who needs to ask questions. I have a question for you.
I mean, I'm happy to stick around as long as needed. I don't know if you have a hard stop at noon, but.
We'll make it a little bit flexible. My question isn't about propaganda, but since you specialize in Central and Eastern European studies, I had a question for you about Turkey and the long wait to join the European Union. Thoughts on that? Why the continued delay? And do you think Turkey will become a part of the European Union eventually?
Well, probably not with Erdogan at its helm. I mean, there are a number of answers I could give you to this. We don't have time to go into this in any great detail, but Turkey certainly does have problems. And anyone who wants to join the EU has to basically harmonize their laws and regulations with this huge body of material that the EU puts out called the Acquis Communautaire. They used to give you a page count on their website. Now they just say over 100,000 pages. They don't even bother to tell you how long this thing is. It's a really arduous process. And Turkey certainly has a lot of problems with human rights and with rights for, let's say, religious minorities. You may know, among other things, recently, Hagia Sophia, which was one of the major churches of Christendom, went from being a museum to being an active mosque again, right? So this is Erdogan playing to his Islamist base. There are also issues with Kurds in the East. Frankly, there are also issues with the fact that the Kurdish population is growing, and there are concerns about this in Europe that, if Schengen, meaning the free movement of people, is allowed, you basically have a country with fertility rates much higher than the rest of Europe who would be sending people to other parts of Europe, and it would become potentially one of the largest voting blocs in the European Parliament. Now, all of this is fine, but then we look at a country like Bulgaria and Romania, who arguably had just as bad problems, but were allowed to join the EU. I think Islamophobia does certainly play a role in this, right? Turkey has repeatedly accused the EU of being tacitly a Christian club, and I think there's something to that. So it's a very complicated question because Europe hasn't really defined itself, right? I mean, if Turkey is admitted to the EU, think about where Europe's borders end. On Iraq? Is that Europe? I don't know, but it's a question worth asking. On the other hand, to deny the sort of tacit, I think, I've actually done quite a bit of research into this when the Constitution Treaty, which later became the stripped down Treaty of Lisbon, which was finally adopted in 2009, was being written. I think people who claim Islamophobia have really good grounds for claiming this as well, that Turkey is just viewed as being culturally different than Europe. And that's why even some pretty secular states like France, across many different ideological party families, have been opposed to Turkey's accession to the European Union.
Dr. Soroka.
There's a lot more I could say, but let me stop right there.
I'll message you. I'll email you for more details about this. I'm very curious to know your position. Timothy, you have a question. You're next.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. I love the presentation. I would have liked to hear more about the recipients of propaganda. I typed in the chat there, who are the people who believe this stuff? When I hear this stuff, when I hear Caesar is divine or a new star is created in the heavens, you're instantly a fraud and a liar, and I've reduced my support for you and my belief. But apparently I'm in the minority in all of history, and there are people who gobble this stuff up and now they believe it. I know it's sensitive and we don't want to insult anybody, but what's going on there? How do we get people to recognize this stuff when they see it?
Well, I think it starts with education, and I think it starts with critical thinking. And I'm really a little despairing. I have young children. I have students who are college age in my classes. I think critical thinking skills are quite low. And it's not to say that there aren't places in the world where the educational system does a good job of this. I think Finland, to my mind, is a really good example. They have a whole unit beginning in elementary school on how to recognize digital misinformation. And the kind of empirical results seem to suggest it's quite good. I do, though, want to be careful about painting with too broad of a brush. There is a fair amount of research that suggests it's actually more intelligent people that are prone to propaganda than less intelligent people. And part of the reason for this is that many of us are trying to figure out a way to pull everything together, right? We live in this age of media overload, information overload. And if I'm not all that highly intelligent, I may not even realize the cognitive dissonance between holding disparate ideas in my head, right? But if I am average or maybe a little above average, some types of cognitive dissonance, right, holding two different or multiple different positions in my head, are really psychologically uncomfortable. So if someone comes along and says, aha, I can explain it all to you. It's a global conspiracy. It's being run by, I don't know, George Soros or the Illuminati. Suddenly, I have that moment where, oh my goodness, it all clicks. It all makes sense. All of these weird, disparate ideas in my head, I can suddenly put them together. Now, obviously, this doesn't work for everyone, but I think it would be a disservice to say that it's only kind of the silly people who believe, a new star was created in the heavens. It's a lot of us who just don't have enough information to make decisions, and we'll kind of go with whoever gives us the story or preconceived notions are sort of most likely to accept, right? That will cause us the least cognitive dissonance. The other thing is a lot of propaganda is much more subtle. Think about advertising. And I know many of you are going to say, I'm savvy. I'm not swayed by advertising. I have news for you. You are. Otherwise, the advertising industry would not spend billions upon billions upon billions every single year. You are swayed by advertising. You may just not know it.
Thank you, Dr. Soroka. I see that we have 4 hands up in the chat. We'll try to get through these as swiftly as possible. Andra, go ahead with your question.
When you said that you're old enough to remember when the unfortunate September incident happened, it reminded me the other day I was talking to this lovely lady who was a military spouse in Germany in the 80s, and she was telling me how she used to have to get a visa to go visit France and how it was a whole ordeal. And it made me think about you have all this experience. I was wondering if you could comment briefly on how do you think that this new world that we live in, where AI touches everything, is gonna change the discourse around memory politics and the post-communist societies, like the one that I'm from and Amina is from, especially in the context of historical narratives. And hopefully we don't lose those realities of what truly happened.
It's a huge problem. It's going to become exponentially bigger. I have a man who I invite to give a talk to in my class on propaganda. He is a futurist. He's someone who works on AI. He is a former military officer in the United States Army. He now trains a lot of the people at NATO headquarters on disinformation and disinformation campaigns. And, he paints, I hate to kind of end on this, but he paints a picture of the coming world that is really dysfunctional. Deep fakes are so good now that people just won't be able to recognize them. The problem is they're still expensive, right? So only some governments have the economic wherewithal and the technical capability to really deploy them in their full form. The question is, what happens when this becomes a lot more accessible? What happens when corporations are able to deploy them? What happens when private actors or terrorist groups are able to deploy them? It's perfectly possible that we will start seeing videos of manufactured massacres, or we will start seeing videos of massacres that actually happened, but it looks like the other side committed them, right? Instead of the people that actually did this. I'm pretty terrified of that day. And this is why I teach the class. I think it's so important to be savvy about what forms propaganda can take. But I also think it's really important that we play a role in contacting our leaders, contacting people who are responsible for educational policy, and really insisting that these be things that be taught, that critical thinking be taught to individuals, and that we maintain a way of, as best we can, staying on top of these advancements, because the technology is light years ahead of where I think we are in a collective sense relative to being able to understand what propaganda is and how it's being deployed. And the technology is only getting better every single day.
Thank you, Dr. Soroka, and thank you, Andrea, for that amazing question. Max, you're up next.
Thank you, Dr. Soroka. That was really informative. My question deals with the Russian information war. I know there's a lot of perceptibility and susceptibility that the Western media has, and policymakers have been adamantly criticized for not doing much to intercept Russian agents in our media space. I'm wondering how far you think it's going to go and where we could be.
Well, I think it's quite interesting that the indicators are there's no slowdown. It's not just Russia. I mean, China's also, we know, engaging in this disinformation.
Hand in hand.
Hand in hand. It's only going to get worse, I think, as we go further into this presidential election cycle in the United States. You know, for a long period of time, Russia denied any kind of foreign influence operations, and then Yevgeny Prigozhin finally admitted that he was behind a lot of these disinformation campaigns. Prigozhin was the one whose plane, well, mysteriously blew up after he tried to engage in what looked like an abortive coup not that long ago. And it also looks like these groups are cooperating and learning from one another. So I would suggest to you, Max, read the Facebook 2017 white paper to start getting a handle on this, because it goes in great detail into how these cells are cooperating, right? And how different elements of what looks to be military intelligence, or at least hackers sponsored by military intelligence, how they're going about these campaigns. But there are basically two types of campaigns that Russia and China have waged. And I want to be clear, I don't think they're the only ones doing it, right? I think even the West is doing it to some extent. But there are two types of campaigns. There's one that is just brute force. So it's putting out information on a mass scale. A lot of it is not particularly sophisticated. These are kind of the trolls you read on comment boards, and it's pretty obvious because the English is bad and it just doesn't make sense. And then there are the more sophisticated targeted attacks, right? Where you have someone who's writing in fluent English and kind of making appropriate cultural references and so forth. The brute force attacks will, just by sheer volume, have some influence, but they're not particularly effective overall. It's really the targeted influence campaigns that have me most concerned.
Thank you. Pat, you have your next question, please.
Hi, is it my turn?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'd like you to comment on like a social media platform like TikTok. So is it propaganda going to be run by the state only. How do you feel about the, something like TikTok, and how like now everyone is like advertising themselves online and like using like photo filter, or like, somehow like, presenting something that is not real and tricking like each other?
Yeah, well, again, I think this picks up on the comments I made already, that I think it's kind of a dystopian vision of the world. I don't have much of a social media presence, in part because this is something I study, and I'm concerned about having too much of a social media presence. What do I think about TikTok? I mean, certainly very politicized on all sides of it. I do share some concerns about information being stolen, but here the bigger concern about TikTok is that information will be used by the Chinese government on users, right? It's not necessarily that TikTok content creators are propaganda shills for China, right? I mean, certainly some of them very well may be, but if you've looked at TikTok, you know that the average level of discourse is probably not high enough to actually move the geopolitical needle. It's more bread and circuses. It's more distraction, I think, for many people, and kind of behind the scenes information gathering on citizens. But it's a huge problem. It's a growing problem. The other thing I will mention with social media is, think about growing up now. Those of you who are younger, I think about all the kind of stupid things I did as a kid. I mean, nothing huge, nothing illegal or anything, but I did some things I don't want posted on social media. But now this information follows you around forever, right? And think about the potential leverage that gives someone that wants to exploit that against you, right? It's concerning. And it's why Europe has this law on the right to forget. For those of you who don't know what this is, I would urge you to look it up. It's probably not administered as well as it could be, but it's an interesting legal precedent that we certainly don't have in the United States. Should information be online forever, whether it's true or not? And if it is, to what degree does that expose us to potential propagandists in the future, particularly if we are well-known figures or prominent individuals?
Thank you, Professor.
Igor?
Yes, I had a question. So based on this discussion, it sounds like Western governments are going to have to think creatively about limiting the freedom of speech in order to also limit the reach of the propaganda distributed by foreign actors, right? So
yeah, well, I think these are two separate questions, and or two separate responses. I want to be very clear. I'm a free speech absolutist. I do not think free speech should be limited, full stop. What I think we should do is have far more educational opportunities to teach people how to discern fake information from truthful information. Again, I love these questions, but this is a bigger conversation we can have about the demise of expertise in the United States. The fact that we don't trust experts any longer. The fact that, as with the example of the person I'm dealing with right now, this person is trained as a lawyer, right? But he's commenting on COVID vaccines. Like, what in the world is your background to do this? But for a lot of people, that's enough. So I think we have to address that, and we can address that with literacy campaigns, digital literacy campaigns. I don't think we should be prohibiting free speech. That's my personal feeling, because I think that's a very slippery slope. The other side of this is active disinformation campaigns put on by foreign governments to achieve some sort of nefarious end. Yes, I think absolutely that should be targeted. That is being targeted, but I think we can certainly ramp up efforts to do so. Because that's not free speech. That's intervention, deliberate attempts to intervene in a democratic process.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And with that, I want to ask if there are any final follow-up questions before we move on to the General Assembly. Going once, going twice. I know I have 5 million questions for you, Dr. Soroka, but I'm going to spare you right now and email them to you.
Well, thank you for those wonderful questions that I did hear. I appreciate everyone participating. It's been fun to be with you. If anyone wants to get in touch, I'm happy to do it. I'm easy enough to find. Take care, everyone.
This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Soroka, and we look forward to speaking to you again, hopefully soon.
Great. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Amina, hold on one second. I'm just going to stop and restart the recording so that we have two separate ones.